Sir, the Galactic Emperor has requested you complete a VO2 max test.
Then it shall be done.
Today we are going to talk about a very important question, and that is whether Darth Vader is the least fit Sith. So how does this question even come about? Well, if you think about it, a lot of us Star Wars nerds might also be gym nerds. And is Darth Vader the OG gym bro? He looks big, he looks scary. He's probably a nice guy deep down, but if he lost his dog or it ran outside of his fenced-in yard, would he be able to catch it? Do I think he's the coolest Sith? Yes. Would I be terrified if he walked into my house? Also yes. Do I think if the Force were taken away from him, he'd probably be nothing but a loud walker? I'd say probably yes. So let's talk about how Vader's burn injuries, his inefficiencies in his suit and mechanics, and his temperature regulation, maybe something you've never thought about, are Vader's biggest factors in making him the least fit Sith. Welcome to the Movement Multiverse. My name is Max and I will be the host for today's episode. The Movement Multiverse is a podcast for movement nerds, curious minds, and anyone who wants to think about movement beyond just the gym. Hosted by Max, each episode is intended to give you a new perspective on movement by exploring movement in all its forms, drawing from science, history, culture, fitness, media, and more. No episode is intended to treat any individual's medical problems, for education and entertainment purposes only. So let's start with how burns might have affected Darth Vader's movement. Maybe something you haven't considered, or maybe it is something you've considered, but other factors maybe are more obvious, like the suit being extremely large and not shaped very well to fast, agile movement like how Anakin was trained and does not display as he puts on the Darth Vader suit. So burns can absolutely affect how we move. In Anakin's case, or Darth Vader's case, he was burned. It seems like 60 to 80% of his body was covered in thick burns that will absolutely affect the way he moves. In the Revenge of the Sith, it seems as though it takes a few days for the surgery to take place, where they mend the wounds, they mend the burns, they amputate his legs and his arms, and all of this happens in a matter of days. And at the end of those days, Palpatine stands him up from a tilt table, and Anakin and Darth Vader is able to walk right away. So is that realistic? Probably not. So let's think about how the burns would limit his ability, Darth Vader's ability, to be the best apprentice and most fit Sith. So when we're above even just 10% of the body being burned, especially as we get into more, say, second degree or third degree burns, the ability to move becomes extremely limited. That burn could reach muscle tissue. It could reach bone tissue. It reaches the fascial tissue. And as the body heals, that tissue gets extremely tense as it heals into scar tissue, making the ability to move very difficult. And what seems to be less likely is that when Vader is able to stand up from the tilt table and goes on his first battle just a few days later, even a month later, his ability to defeat someone is very unlikely. We also have to think about the psychological impact that a burn might have on Vader. Deep medication might be required to heal, so he's having the effect of medication, he's having the effect of potentially being afraid of going near flame, and he's also still dealing with the fact that his burns often take months or years to heal. And it seems as though during the surgery, or even after the surgery, the positioning of his body, say in either that cooling tank or on the table while they're doing surgery, was not conducive to healing the tissues in a way that would allow best movement. So if we were to heal Darth Vader all over again, he got burned, we need to make him into Darth Vader. The best way to allow for healing, especially with these deep burns across the entire width of the body, is to have him into a very spread out position where the skin can heal in an elongated way. His arms were by his pockets, his hands by his side, his legs were close together. So if you think about how the skin would heal, it'd be very tight, making those first initial days of healing and weeks of healing not conducive to Vader being very fit. And on top of the burns, on top of the psychological factors that Vader might be experiencing, apart from going from good to evil, is his amputated arms and legs. So Vader was able to get up from that tilt table really fast. He took a couple of steps, something probably nobody with that amount of burn or amputation level will be able to do. So those inefficiencies as he got up, or that motor control, motor learning, would likely not be possible for months, even years after the initial surgery. So let's go back to that positioning discussion, especially during construction, and how it likely reduced his function as Palpatine's apprentice. Optimal position often takes months to years to encourage proper healing of skin to prevent some sort of movement disorder or decreased movement that Vader experiences. You might notice Vader is unable to lift his arms overhead during battle. Yes, his saber goes over his head, but his elbows actually never really go over his head. His speed is reduced. His range of motion during strikes is reduced. However, they are very powerful. So in this discussion, although we're mentioning all the things that make him not very fit, also consider how the Force, his ability to use the Force, can overcome these things, and how the Force makes Vader likely the most terrifying Sith. We can also talk about how the burn and the suit impact each other. So is the suit a pressure garment? When we deal with burns, the capillaries or the vascular system surrounding these burns is often compromised. They might be restricted or unable to expand. So that to heal, we need increased blood flow, we need increased oxygen, but it also doesn't allow the blood to return back to the heart. So some sort of pressure garment, some sort of compression garment, is the suit designed for that? Is it designed to allow for temperature regulation? Can Vader efficiently get rid of heat? Can he cool himself well? Is his skin allowing some sort of evaporation? And it seems like likely not. It seems like the suit is made out of some sort of thick leather material, making that, on top of the burns, even harder to move. Also with the burn, we have to talk about internal burn injuries. So although the visible outside injuries are obvious, it's likely that he had some sort of inhalation burn injury that affected his lungs, making that breathing noise that you hear during every single scene that he's in more logical. So what happens when the lungs are burned internally is the skin surrounding the lungs becomes thin. The structures inside the lungs are no longer viable. They're less compliant, meaning that as we breathe in or out, the lungs aren't able to expand as well, meaning less oxygen is getting to the blood that we need, especially during those external burns as we're trying to heal. The lungs also require movable skin and ribs to maintain that ventilation capacity. And we know that with Vader's injury, the surrounding skin and tissue of the lungs was compromised. Hence, that external ventilation through the mask is most definitely required, hence the nasal breathing that you hear during Vader's either battles or just in general breathing. And on top of the burns needing to heal, the lungs being infected, the suit restricting movement also being less conducive to burn healing, is that chronic inflammatory state changing fluid levels within his body. So he might be hypovolemic, meaning there's less fluid available in his body for organs to function. Maybe the skin is taking a much longer time to heal beyond the initial couple week phase that a smaller burn might take. So that chronic inflammatory state, chronic swelling, even more likely needing those compression and pressure garments from the suit because of the inflammation, therefore leading to more fatigue, making him need to conserve his energy more and really be more logical in planning out his fluid intake throughout the day, especially when he's going to different planets, traveling, moving around, and battling other Jedi. So we've talked about how burn and other factors might affect Vader's capacity to be the most fit apprentice for Palpatine. So now let's move on to the suit and body mechanics. This might be the more obvious answer as to why Vader's the least fit Sith, but we know the design of his suit is not very conducive to easily moving. The weight of the suit, it looks very heavy, so the continuous restricted movement, especially during battle, requires high effort, high energy, high force, high endurance, it's high load, therefore really increasing the injury risk, especially when he's battling day in and day out. So he has increased injury risk, he has increased energy intake, the capacity for his skin to heal, if we go back to the burns, is made even harder. We can also talk about the shape. The external design, especially when it overlaps, is likely to restrict any movement in one direction or another. So on top of the skin being unable to move because of the burns, you also have the shape of the suit that restricts his movement, especially overhead or outside of his base of support to reach. And then we can talk about the bulk. So it's heavy, it's not designed for good movement, and it's also really bulky. So the design is not stretchy, it seems like. It seems more leathery. So it's thick and not slim, and it's not very conducive to fast and agile movement. So all of these factors, the weight, the shape, the bulk, the inability for it to provide pressure or compression that he needs is not either conducive to healing or to Vader being a conducive or a agile apprentice. On top of the suit being designed odd and unable, on top of the suit being heavy, it being shaped odd and not allowing for good movement, and then for the bulk of it not allowing for fast, agile movement, we can think about how the core, especially in relation to his amputation of both legs and both arms, is going to have a really high demand for force output, core control, and stepping power. So this is when you start to think of how the force might come into his ability to battle really well, and for his ability to control his posture, control his walking, control his swinging, control his rotation. He needs extreme amounts of core control. Therefore, it might be more logical that the breathing, the external ventilation that he has, either because of the burn, might also be because his core is already overloaded just to move on its own, that the external ventilation is needed just to breathe. And the suit on its own is very inefficient. So when we talk about inefficiencies, you can notice his gait. He has very heavy steps. He's unable to get the full step length that he might otherwise get with a more stretchy suit. He also has to expend more energy and use that towards meditation or being in that cooling tank so that when he goes into battle, he has the energy he needs to make those really hard swings. In terms of energy conservation, he needs to take extreme care in the ability for him to recharge and go back into battle. And he's able to walk, but not very well. If someone similar to him had got the injuries he had, they would likely need very intense therapy. They would likely need devices that would help them ambulate or walk. And the reason I think he's able to do this is because of the force. So walking is a big inefficiency. He needs to be very careful about his energy conservation, and he needs to be careful about how he uses his power and energy in battle. So Vader's saber or lightsaber skills are likely the way they are because of the force and not because of his skills previously as Anakin. As we know, these factors that we've discussed already are impacting so many different variables in his ability to fight. So in terms of a medical perspective, we have the high energy cost, which means slower movement. He might have hypotension because of his inability to return blood from one area of the body back to the heart, either due to the burn restriction or from some other factor. He might have certain diet requirements, so maybe a much higher caloric intake, not only because he moves a lot, he has to move around a heavy suit, and he has to be able to heal his burns. He has to have very specific hydration intake. He has to be able to rest in intervals that allow him to recover quickly, but then go back into intense battle quickly. And it also requires intense, specific daily planning, depending on how he feels, depending on the state of healing he's in, or just other changes in fluid intake or fluid volume of his own body. So we've talked about burns, how that might impact Vader's ability to be fit. We've talked about his suit and how that affects his mechanics and his ability to be fit. Now let's talk about his temperature regulation, something also related to burns, but from a more medical perspective, it might increase his metabolism. It's going to require a specific diet. How can he control his heat within the suit? Does it require a certain evaporation system? Does it increase the cost of moving? What about dehydration? Does he have to intake certain types of fluids or certain types of electrolytes, certain amounts of fluids to reduce the risk of dehydration? Is there a higher potential for heat stroke? So in the end, we can consider all these factors plus others and say that Darth Vader might not be very fit if it weren't for the Force. But what did Palpatine get right in terms of this big surgery and getting Anakin into Darth Vader? He did the amputations early on. He covered the open areas. He got them sutured and covered up. He also ambulated early on, right after the surgery was done, right after the initial healing phase. He covered the entire skin area. He may or may not have applied pressure garments, and he had some sort of cooling vessel for healing to control that temperature. So Palpatine got a few things right, which is good. But what about things that he got wrong? So it's likely that Vader would have collapsed right away as soon as he got up from laying on his back flat, being tilted up into standing, and then taking his first couple steps. Why? Because of the hypotension risk, so low blood pressure. We can talk about the high state of nervous system input that likely would have sent a signal of alarm right away as he came into his first couple steps. It's very likely that his amputated legs and brain would have been unable to coordinate walking in any way, especially right early on, and making Vader his apprentice right away likely decreased the chance of the Empire surviving for much longer, especially as they had just destroyed the Jedi Temple.
These are rather insignificant in my capacity to yield the Force. Your analysis of my abilities is what makes you vulnerable.
Anyway, if you found this episode entertaining or valuable, give the podcast a follow, comment any ideas or value you found in the episode, and listen to any of our other episodes to learn about movement through a fresh lens. See you next time.